Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Corporate Social Responsibility virtual panel. We're going to give it a few moments as people are logging on. We will get started around 8:35. So welcome, and just sit tight for a few minutes as everyone gets logged in. All right, good morning, everyone. We still have people joining us, but I will go ahead and get started. My name is Kyla Carlson. I am the Director of Programs with Co.act Detroit. Thank you so much for being with us here today. If you are not familiar, Co.act is a place for nonprofits to get connected to resources as well as each other. We are typically a physical space, though these days we are doing that work virtually. The Corporate Social Responsibility series is a series of conversations that we host aimed at connecting folks across sectors with the nonprofit community. When we began planning the series for the year in December and January, we had this idea to do a conversation around what the next economic downturn might look like and how nonprofits can be thinking about that. And in the midst of everything that's happened over the past 45 days, we have accelerated that conversation and tweaked it a little bit to be particularly relevant in that moment, in this moment. So we're really excited to have you all here today. I'm going to turn it over to Gary Dems of the Nonprofit Personnel Network, who will be moderating the panel this morning. Oh, and quick announcement, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. There will be time for the panelists to respond to questions at the end, but we ask that you put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kylan. Thanks for this opportunity. Good morning, everybody. We have close to 90 people on the line, and that just shows how much interest there is in this subject matter. The third largest workforce in the country is the nonprofit sectors, and they deliver critical services to our communities, as you know. So the growing public health crisis that's been sparked by the COVID-19 outbreak has presented some unique challenges for the nonprofit leaders and organizations, as I'm sure you're all feeling it. In this edition of the Corporate Social Responsibility, this is the third in a series of 5 that we're doing. The goal is to talk about how economic contractions impact nonprofits, how the philanthropic and corporate sectors are responding, and how collaboration, resiliency, and adaptability can sustain our sectors. The landscape and the ecosystem in relationship to all the different sectors impacting nonprofits was fluid before we even got into the whole COVID world. And now it's either frozen some organizations have ramped up, but every organization is looking at their strategies in a completely different way than they were even 30 to 60 days ago. Just this morning, if you read the Cranes release or following some of the news, looking at public-private partnerships out in the community, that DTE and Skillman and some other funders are looking at providing laptops to the Detroit Public Schools, and in effect down the road a little bit into the charter school system. So that's a public-private partnership that's playing out. If you saw, for example, that Boys and Girls Clubs are looking at, like other organizations, their earned revenue, the downgrading of their events or the changing of their events. And so we're seeing in real time agencies and everybody on this call having to deal with alternative strategies. And just yesterday or the day before, the Co.act Activate Fund received over 300 applications for their funding. And so the need for capacity building, re-strategizing, retrenching for the nonprofit sector is really ramping up like never before. We have a great panel this morning. I'm going to introduce them and read their bios briefly, and then we'll get into the questions, and we'll allow time for questions at the end. I'd like to welcome Jason Tinsley. Jason is the Michigan Market Manager for JP Morgan Private Bank. He manages more than 40 professionals who oversee more than $7 billion of client assets. Previously, he worked on the Michigan team as a senior banker, working to provide wealth management solutions to ultra high net worth individuals and families. Prior to joining the private bank, Jason served as a district manager, overseeing the sales and operations for Chase branches across southeastern Michigan. He serves on a number of boards and community organizations, and previous positions including the immediate past board chair of the Detroit Urban League, president of Detroit PAL, and member of the Founders Junior Council of the DIA. He's also a board member for Beaumont Healthcare Foundation, the Detroit Jazz Festival Foundation, and the Detroit Children's Fund. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree from Central Michigan University. I'd like to also welcome this morning Meredith Freeman, who is the Director of Alignment and Impact Investing at the Max M. and Marjorie S. Fisher Foundation. Meredith has extensive experience in the social impact sector and community development. She's worked with the LISC Group, Local Initiatives Support Corporation, Citibank Global Community Relations, and her current role is the Director of Alignment and Impact Investing with the Fisher Foundation. In 2014, Meredith was selected for the inaugural class of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network. She received her BA from Michigan State, an MS in Management and Urban Policy from the New School University in New York, and also has served as an adjunct faculty for the graduate level courses in nonprofit management at Seton Hall University and at New School in New York. Kelly Kuhn, most of you are familiar with. She's Vice President for the Michigan Nonprofit Association, statewide membership organization dedicated to serving the diverse nonprofit sector through civic engagement, capacity building, data and technology, and advocacy. She provides ongoing support and expertise to all management personnel and is responsible for establishing the annual goals and objectives of MNA, as well as overseeing the policies and procedures for the organization, all of its functions, programs, and affiliates, and the day-to-day operations. Before joining MNA, Kelly was a nonprofit consultant and executive director of the Jackson Nonprofit Support Center and has extensive experience in nonprofit training, technical assistance, and needs assessment, focusing on management support and capacity building. A proud graduate, along with me, of Western Michigan University, Kelly also received a Master's of Business Administration from Eastern Michigan University. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists, and we'll kick things off. We're going to throw it over to Jason first and talk a little bit about some of the things that you're seeing out in the marketplace in the public-private partnerships in the corporate social responsibility and some of the things you're seeing from the private banking side. Jason?
Hey, Gary, thank you. You actually stole some of my thunder because some of the news that came out earlier today and late last night is very relevant to what I want to talk about, but can definitely enhance upon. And that's exactly what it is. It's the partnership. It's the public-private partnership between corporations having an understanding of their individual or their respective communities and being able to partner with both civic and obviously the foundation and endowment space. And just to kind of talk about where I sit, you know, and you mentioned in my bio, like I have a love for community service, community outreach. I was raised that way. And at every step of my professional career, being able to be engaged in this community that I've never left. You know, in my 45 years of life and in my 24 years professionally, I've always been right here in Southeastern Michigan, specifically Detroit. Being able to see that partnership between the corporations I work at, along with the boards I serve on, but making sure that it's never about us having an initiative that doesn't engage a conversation with the people who are in need the most. So when I look at what we saw with the DPS and you know, how quickly they were able to galvanize a plan to put the money in place for students, I mean, it rings to the fact that if you look back at what we went through during the grand bargain with that $800 million, and that took a little while to get everybody on board. But you know, sometimes in crisis and calamity, you move more expeditiously, and then you're able to move a lot faster to execute that which you know makes sense. And the fact that you look at the mayor got involved, civic leaders got involved, and obviously the corporate philanthropy community got involved as well. They've always been at the table with each other, but to move that fast to do something that made that much sense, that just speaks to the type of community we have. And it's not that others don't have it, but I see it here more and more in Southeastern Michigan. When I look back over the last 5 years, we made a $200 million commitment that started only at 100 to really do impactful things in the space of community, focused on sustainability, but focused around job skills, small business expansion, financial health, neighborhood revitalization. But it took a lot of moving parts to get everybody on board. But now I'm beginning to see that the ability to do that and do it quickly and do it when needed is actually happening faster and faster and faster. And that article that came out about DTE and Skillman, and I'm tied to Detroit Children's Fund, which is loosely tied to Skillman. When that came out yesterday, it just spoke to the fact that, again, when we're in crisis, you see the best of Detroiters and how they come together to make things happen.
Great, thank you. So let's throw it over to Meredith for a little bit of perspective from the foundation side and with your background.
Great, thanks, Gary. So I just want to start out by saying nonprofit organizations have always been resilient. I mean, I just think what's inherent to the nonprofit sector is being able to ride the funding waves, right? Ride the wave of donor fatigue and funders who will fund something for a couple of years and then change their minds. Programs, grant programs that organizations have been dependent on for years that just disappear after a while. And so I think organizations have always had a sense of resiliency just by the nature of their revenue streams and kind of what they do and who they are. And so I don't see anything different in terms of the resiliency in this case. I think organizations are being very, very creative. I think they're doing everything from changing their content and program to online very quickly. I think that they are tapping into the knowledge base that they have available to them through their staff, through their board members, their peers, through community residents and people they serve. And they have just moved very quickly and with great intention and in a very, very smart way to think about how to continue to survive, and not only just survive, but continue to serve the communities that they're committed to, which again, I just feel like is just a part of who nonprofit organizations are. And it's just a part of our sector that I'm really, really proud of and have seen for my entire career. So I just wanted to put that out there first, that this is something that nonprofit leaders have always done and have done well. And so kudos to everyone for doing a great job. And I know that we will all continue to do well in this way.
Great, thank you. And Kelly, you have a pretty unique perspective statewide, and in the lead up to this call and the planning for this call, a lot of it is about sustainability and flexibility, finances, things like that. But what are your perspectives from a statewide standpoint and some of the trends you're seeing in the collaborative area?
Yeah, so a couple things that we've seen through the Michigan Nonprofit Association and some of our partners. Our state is unique in that grant makers and grant seekers work together. In following the comments that have been made around the resiliency, I think it also helps that, we see examples like Jason talked about that happen quickly. And I think it's as a result of the fact that oftentimes the philanthropic and corporate communities already have established partnerships. They already have, deep roots into community. And I think that helps when you're able to bring things online much quicker. And so I think, again, unique to the DNA of Michigan, that is not like any other state across the country. Grant makers and the grant seekers work very well together. And I think you can see that from the example on a local level, but also statewide. We are in constant contact with the Council of Michigan Foundations, which is our kind of sister organizations for philanthropic organizations, both all including family, corporate, community foundations, all types of foundations across Michigan. So we are working in tandem with them, and are sharing the information that we get through our various outreach that we do to our membership base, but then also just feedback loops that we are collecting information to really be able to stand up and articulate what is and what are issues for nonprofits. Around all of the activity around opportunities that are available that have not become available for nonprofits historically, like programs like the Paycheck Protection Program and other things, working in conjunction with the Small Business Administration of Michigan and others to be sure that we're leveraging our networks to be sure that nonprofits are aware of these opportunities. They are, in essence, sometimes considered and often identified as small businesses. So some of the things that they need from an HR and a finance perspective are not necessarily any different than what a small business. Sometimes their budget sizes and their needs are in alignment. What's different and what sets us apart, though, is balancing operating as a small business or operating to sustain ourselves and our operations while still meeting mission and still meeting need in community. So right now, what we're seeing and what we've communicated and started to kind of put a framework together around this work to be thinking about how nonprofits are not just thinking about the immediate, which we are identifying as kind of that relief phase, but how are they thinking about things in a response phase, which is another thing that we're starting to see, happen with regard to making sure there's resources and information and trusted guidance for nonprofits in supporting, but also thinking a little long-term in their planning around recovery and reform. So what we've really tried to do is organize and help nonprofits not only see what's right in front of them, which is often and has been the case, I think, not just for nonprofits, but for anybody. How are we choosing to respond, day to day, as well as thinking about and forecasting what does the next month or two look like. But the reality is how nonprofits will navigate and how communities will navigate is a really 2 to 3, if not 5-year time frame. And so, at this point, when we're talking about and seeing things happening from our perspective, we're not only trying to think about how to lend support in the short term, but also be thinking about and strategizing on things that need to happen and look different in the long term. And so I think as we think about it in the spirit of collaboration and we look at partnerships, it's balancing both because both are going to be needed.
Yeah, that's great. And that was going to lead into my next question. And this may be on one for Jason and one for Meredith on how you're seeing, because when I'm talking with a lot of nonprofits, they're saying, yes, we're in emergency mode. And so they gear up all of their staff time or their fundraising time or their board time on utilizing their relationships for emergency funding or crisis funding. And then they're approaching their funders. And the funders are saying, yes, that's great. And we're going to stick with who we have. We're not really accepting new folks in the door. So what's the correlation between what you're seeing both on the corporate side for Jason and on the foundation side for Meredith related to how you're talking to the nonprofits about current funding and what dollars are available from a crisis standpoint, and then how that plays out longer term to Kelly's point. So maybe I'll throw that to Jason first, maybe what you're seeing from the bank standpoint in your purview.
Yep, and I can speak from the bank standpoint and even from the boards I sit on where I have to sit in the other position as a board member. And let me say this to the nonprofits on the line today, that this is the time where you really need to see your board members step up and really be active in the advocacy of the organization that they've chosen to support. And personally, number one, and then number two, being able to make the phone calls and make the ask to get what you need as far as resources. I think from a corporate standpoint, obviously these are uncommon times, right? And organizations, provide critical services. That's where you see a lot of the influx of capital. But I would say for institutions like ours and others, it's also a time for you to be flexible. And, can we have flexibility given the urgent and unique times around this particular situation? For instance, can we move potential program dollars to general fund dollars, right? Because a lot of times our organizations, we're really built around helping to support and sustain programs. But this is a time where if we don't have an organization, then we won't have a program. And I think working with institutions to make sure that flexibility is there in a time like this is super important. And that's where that relationship to be able to talk to whoever sits in the seat of the corporate responsibility chair or making sure that the people truly understand the mission of the organization, and that when that particular institution or that foundation or endowment or that corporate partner, when it's time to go to the table to look at what they had planned for 2020 and 2021, that there's got to be some flexibility there to be able to loosen the reins, take the gloves off, and maybe go in a different direction when it comes to funding.
And Jason, does that relate to more transparency in the relationship with your funders, individual donors, corporations, foundations? Are you finding, transparency has always been the watchword, but are you seeing that people that you're funding and so on are looking and being transparent about their financial situations, and you appreciate that, obviously?
No, yeah, absolutely. But I'll go a step further. I think from a corporate standpoint, you're going to see, if you haven't, but there's always been, and definitely with us, we try to, because we are a bank, we try to really sit side by side and figure out ways to partner with you as you're creating and constructing your plan to make sure that it's financially feasible and that it's fiscally responsible and that we're not drifting into different places and that we're focused on the mission at hand so we can support you and drive that mission. So yeah, sitting side by side with you to make sure that you're able to, one, take hold of whatever it is we're trying to give you so that you can go ahead and execute in the community. That's a partnership. That's a walk we take together. We've been far removed from the days of just writing checks without having a bit of a expectation as to what that looks like and how we can be supportive. And then typically the commitment in what we do tends to grow when we feel like we're allowing for an organization that is growing and we can grow with them. And then that allows us to have more of as you mentioned, because of the transparency of the relationship, we can be more of a partner on the path down the way so that when you have 2020 hit with with what's going on now with COVID, and there'll be something else in 2 or 3 years, of course, that we'll say, hey, you know what? That's not you. That's not the reason. You're not the reason that this is not going in the direction we want it to go. So we're going to support you in the midst of this struggle so we can get you back to the organization we've known you to be. But because this right now is going to set a lot of institutions and organizations back a little bit, as there's a shift of money to what we call the most vulnerable or to more immediate needs if you don't fall into that particular space.
Great. And Meredith, what are you seeing in that realm from the foundation standpoint?
Very similar to what Jason described in terms of flexibility, number one, and shifting programmatic dollars to general operating support if that's needed. Also shifting budget line items. So if there's a budget line item for something that could be used now for something else, and then doing that as well, just within budgets. And also from an impact investing perspective for the program related investments that we have at Fisher, making some shifts there and use of funds as well. So there's been some folks who really wanted to like, wow, this is the time where I need to shift the concessionary rate PRI dollars to pay off higher interest debt. For some places that are not as flexible in terms of the repayment of loans, or using PRI dollars that were designated for something else to now support working capital needs because of the need to keep staff on board or something like that. And so it's really just having those conversations with our partners, listening to what they need, and then working along with them to respond, as Jason pointed out. And I would also say that what we're doing internally is really talking to our board and being in close contact with them to let them know what's going on, because this is an opportunity for boards to step up, but they have to have the information. So you have to be very closely connected with your board members, describing what's going on the ground, relaying those partner conversations and the needs that are being expressed, and then asking the board to even make some moves that they may not necessarily make or would have made if it hadn't been for this crisis. I know some foundations are granting new dollars over and above the 5% requirement, and that's something that that we've just done with our first round of emergency grant response at Fisher, and that other foundations are doing. So I just think that being flexible, talking with the partners, understanding what their needs are, engaging your board, making sure that they're well informed, making some recommendations, and having those conversations about how we can shift and do things different things internally as well are just vitally important right now.
Can you do a quick primer on what a PRI is for those in the audience that don't know?
Yeah, so a program related investment, or a PRI, is basically could be a loan or equity investment in a nonprofit organization, in a social enterprise that's concessionary in nature. So it's below market rate in terms of the interest rates could be like 0 to 3%. So it's much more affordable than going to a bank. The terms are usually more patient and flexible. And it really responds to a need that is both market driven to some extent, but also has a charitable purpose. So it has to have the charitable purpose in order to be considered a PRI, but provides that concessionary flexible capital that a lot of nonprofit organizations need and social enterprises need in order to meet both the financial and the kind of human capital nature of whatever project or business that they're supporting.
Great, thank you. Now this is a question, and this may have come out when Callie and I were talking a little bit earlier, but you mentioned that not all of the sustainability of the organizations in the community and the Detroit and statewide, this is not going to be solved by pure dollars coming from corporations, coming from foundations, coming from private donors. Do you see other sources, or do you see trends in the community that these nonprofit agencies can tap into related to bigger dollars, either from state government or whatever, or in collaboration with corporations, foundations, and so on? Where do you see the biggest sort of safety net coming from in this grouping or beyond this grouping?
Right. Let me respond to that with a couple things first, but I promise I will respond to that question. Based off of the comments that were made previously from Jason and Meredith, advice that I think we would give to nonprofit leaders, especially those on the call, is not to go about this alone, right? So I know we're talking about collaboration, and I know we're talking about partnerships, with corporate and philanthropy, but even to answer your question, Gary, it's going to take more than philanthropy and corporations to help sustain and weather this. And so it's going to become very important in the messaging that we have is the understanding and the communication and the advocacy that's going to be needed for the sector, right? So we're the third largest economy in the state of Michigan. 10% of the economy and the jobs associated with that are from the nonprofit sector. Oftentimes we're not the first sector to be thought of, in general. And so when I think about it, it's not just about forming partnerships, and while those are certainly important, it's about the advocacy that will be needed from foundations and corporations, and it exists now. So let me assure you that it's not that it doesn't exist now, but it's really having that collective voice come up to say that funds like a Paycheck Protection Program, which is the first time that nonprofits have been able to access something like that. And that's just one example. But, in 08 and 09, when the Great Recession started to occur, there were opportunities that were provided for federal funds that were just focused on building the capacity of nonprofits. Shortly after those two legislations, the Strengthening Communities Fund and the Reinvestment Act. So they were tied to federal legislation in that way that were specifically carved out for nonprofits to build capacity. And that was across the country. But Michigan was very, very fortunate to have a lot of intermediary organizations that were able to leverage those dollars. But those dollars at that time came with matches. So it's an example of saying, like, even in lessons learned back from 08 and 09, those still to leverage, upwards of $6 million and $7 million to bring dollars into the state, those required partnerships. So I think, we're looking at those partnerships creatively all the time to say, how do we ensure that Michigan gets as much money as possible for whoever needs to be supporting on the front lines, whether it's a nonprofit organization, whether it's a small business, rallying together and having a collective voice is really important. And again, it's going to take all of us doing that, and all of us being in lockstep with what's the messaging, what's the data telling us, being able to say things like 10% of our workforce is tied to nonprofits. That's a lot of jobs that are at risk right now. And also at the same time, those same people in those jobs are being asked to meet basic needs for people across the entire state. And so, things that we're seeing from our perspective, back to comments made, is we are seeing foundations and corporations in particular coming together to create shared pools of funds that nonprofits can access all over the state. We know that there's dollars that are being in Southeastern Michigan. The United Way is coordinating, right? Like, everybody's pooling together resources in addition to looking out for their grantees, the foundation community, and ensuring we are seeing, and probably can almost say, if it's not all of them, it's definitely close to all of the foundations. And we have a lot of foundation relationships directly tied to grants that we're managing, in particular in the work that we're doing around census right now. So we're seeing this firsthand, where as a grantee, I am seeing a communication come from a foundation that is saying, we are going to afford you the flexibility to look at your grants, to decide what is best for you. How do we repurpose that? So I just want to assure people that we're seeing pooled funds come together. We are seeing flexibility in And this is across the state, not just with relationships in Southeastern Michigan. But again, it's going to take everybody. I want to support Jason's comment around the boards. The board members definitely need to be, and you as nonprofit leaders, we need to be leveraging our boards. We need to be leveraging their relationships. But we've got to give them the tools and the resources to be strong advocates for our work, right? Like we eat and breathe our organizations every day. What we have to do is turn our board members, if they're not already, into the best evangelists for our work as we can. I think the personal contribution, it starts there. I would agree with that. I agree with making phone calls through the networks. Because it's important that nonprofits and nonprofit leaders have the ability to engage them effectively to meet their needs. And again, back to the 4R framework, nonprofits need to be having conversations with their board members and thinking strategically about decisions that have to be made in the short term, as well as how that might impact in the long term. And it's a delicate balance right now because these are the same organizations, again, that are balancing how much food can they put out into community, other things that are needed, again, as basic needs and on the front lines. I think one way that would be helpful in the kind of collaboration of things is for us to be thinking about how we're supporting nonprofit leaders and their teams and being able to put a strategy or a contingency plan or scenario plans in place that really identify the assets that they currently have because right now, for instance, nonprofits are operating in a market where returns on investments and endowments are still good. In coming in the near future, whatever that might be, our foundations and our corporations are going to be operating in a world where that is no longer the case. And so resources become tight. So, starting to think about that now and leveraging things like a paycheck protection program is not just about meeting your demands in the next 8 weeks. It's about giving you breathing room to realize that you've got your team covered for a period of time that then allows you maybe, and it's like a second of breathing room these days is what it feels like, to maybe strategize and be thinking long-term. But you can't do it alone. You've got to leverage the expertise of your board, the connections of your board, as well as, I think, leveraging connections and relationships that you may already have with corporations and foundations who I believe are very much willing to support nonprofits in this space. So there's my long-winded response to that. You probably won't ask me a question again, so.
No, you're good. So thank you for that. That's some very great perspective. This is a question, I think, a little bit more towards Jason, but because of the board you sit on and where you sit at the bank, what I'm hearing a lot from nonprofits is that there's a concern or a caution that there's going to be so much of a push of dollars into the human service agencies like Forgotten Harvest and Gleaners, or agencies that are dealing with the COVID crisis from an emergency needs standpoint, that there's going to be too much of a focus on that. And then long-term advocacy organizations, arts organizations, and agencies that aren't on the front lines of COVID and the emergency side are going to get left in the dust. So what can the arts organizations and the other organizations that are not dealing with COVID necessarily and not in a mission creep or looking to get, alter what they do on a day-to-day basis, what can they do to stay atop of some of the funding that is going to be available both short and long term? I know there's some arts funding that came down the pike with a coalition of groups recently, $1 million that is out there, but that's short term. So what can the nonprofits that aren't on the front line of the COVID crisis and dealing with hunger issues and things like that, what can they do to get the attention and the funding from the corporate sector? I'll throw that to Jason first.
Yeah, sure. And listen, I think Kelly touched on it, as did Meredith, right? With each time we get in situations where we have to kind of revisit the calculus on how we support organizations, we get better at it. So, yeah, I mean, this time around, there was an allocation inside the CARES Act. I think like $75 million is coming through the NEA to support the arts. I know that's not a lot of money when you aggregate across the entire country, but, I'm not aware of that being done in other times such as these. But what I will say, because you're right, there's some truth to the fact that when you get into a situation that's like more of a pandemic, or there's an actual calamity going on, that funding needs tend to get ranked, right? It's like most vulnerable, then what can you do for healthcare and medical, then food security, mental health, and then unfortunately, but the reality is, as you get further down, it's the arts. But obviously, there are jobs there. There are people who are employed there. So that there has to be some type of care and concern for that as well. But when we go back to talking about how we don't forget about those organizations, I don't think we will forget. And I can only speak to what we've seen locally. I just think that there's probably more of a need to figure out how to navigate in the short run. Back to what I said earlier about funding. Like, is there a way where there was funding to maybe have it less restrictive? Obviously, dinners are going to be cut, concerts are going to be cut, so typical fundraisers and galas are going to be cut. Is there a way, if you already had a schedule, to make sure that you just postpone that date and keep that money, and then help work to navigate what next year's funding looks like, so you can be more impactful to the bottom line instead of having to go to an expense of a dinner? I think just being creative in the ask and just making sure that you're constantly having that conversation, but being mindful of the fact that, again, these are different times and they cause for different measures. I just feel like you're not wrong in the fact that it's going to be tough right now, because the hardest hit and the most vulnerable and the direct community needs are probably always going to get the funding first. Like, that's where, I don't want to speak to other organizations by name, but that's where a lot of these philanthropic organizations are going to focus their time. But I made a couple of phone calls, because I knew that question would come, to other corporations that actually do funding for arts and culture in this area. And they said, listen, Jason, like, we're not going to stop doing it, but we have to just kind of navigate it and have to be sensitive to, if we had $100 to distribute in the community, does the pie shift? But that doesn't mean we're going to stop funding people that we've had long entrenched relationships with, and then it'll shift back when things get better. So some of this is being able to ride out the storm, but making sure that the ask fits the time. And there may be a way to pair those together without getting into mission drift and doing things that don't actually fit the arts and culture's ethos, but still is impactful to the community, until you can get that full funding back, which may be a year or 2 years out.
Yeah, and part of the shakeout, I think, is going to happen down the road when we see what's sifting out there, is that there might be more mergers and acquisitions in the nonprofit community, more collaborations. So it won't all be negative from the standpoint of what's the shakeout of this a year or two down the road. The use of technology, the changes in staffing, all these organizations are going to have efficiencies that they didn't see before, which was a little bit similar to what we saw coming out of 08 and 09. What I want to shift a little bit is practical examples, and then I think we can throw it open for questions from the large group that we have. But I want to talk to each of the individual panelists very briefly about what are some of the specific collaborations and creativity that you're seeing, and if you want to name specific organizations that you're on the board of, or that you're seeing that are coming to you for funding, what are you seeing in a more creative way that you think are good examples to point out to the audience on the phone? And maybe I'll start with Meredith on that.
So I would definitely want to highlight and really thank the United Way of Southeast Michigan for the collaboration and the leadership that they have shown over the last 6 weeks. I mean, from day one of really bringing funders together, bringing organizations together, and really just making sure that they are identifying really all of the needs. I mean, it's amazing how you think you have one thing addressed, and then there's 5 dominoes behind that one thing that are starting to fall. And United Way has done a really great job in coordinating a response and getting funds out on the ground quickly to address those needs. So that's one example of, like Kelly was talking about, the pooled funds, but it goes beyond just the pooled funds. It actually goes to the delivery. And I just want to really highlight their leadership there at the United Way. I would also say on a neighborhood level, the Fisher Foundation has been partnering with the Brightmoor community for more than a decade. And you just see the coming together of these very small businesses and block club captains that are stepping up along with the Brightmoor Alliance and the leadership of Reverend Simmons. And they're doing all kinds of things to address tangible needs like PPE for residents, for folks who are distributing food in the neighborhood. But they're also trying to make sure they're taking care of the residents, the neighborhood residents, kind of mental health and emotional needs as well. And so they're having calls a couple times a week where they're taking care of business, but they're also doing things like offering and hosting. They're about to host like a world tour of arts organizations, starting with the DIA and moving around the country and around the world so that the community can do something together, to lift their spirits, to explore something together, and really focus on the mental and emotional support that's needed, that we're not talking about quite as much as we're talking about people's tangible needs of food and housing and things in employment, which are absolutely necessary. But the emotional and the mental health support is needed as well, especially when people are isolated and don't have that connection. So I think the Brightmoor Alliance with the community members are doing a really good job at doing that, addressing some of those needs as well, making sure our visitors and deliveries are made to seniors who are homebound. And then, like I said, the kind of the things that might be fun and needed as well for the community to come together. So I know that's happening all over, but that's just one example that I'm very close to.
Yeah, that's a great example. And Kelly, what are you seeing good example wise?
Yeah, so a couple of the examples I could speak to, and again, this is going to be from our perspective as a statewide organization, but a couple things that I wanted to make sure to mention. So again, for us right now, we're hyper-focused as long as the resources are there to be sure that Michigan is leveraging as much of any federal opportunity as possible to be sure, again, whether that's a nonprofit or a small business. There's lots of opportunities that are available. Creating education and awareness around that is important. Again, because government and the opportunities they're creating are important. It might be a short-lived awareness pitch right now, but partnerships, like I said, with SBAM and others to be sure that we're leveraging our networks to get the word out collectively on what benefit this could be. Because, truthfully, many of those small businesses are in our neighborhoods. Many of those small businesses are who our nonprofits are partnering with. So it is just as critical that our nonprofits are getting funding as well as those that they partner with. And that we demonstrate that we're in this together, because again, when we think about the employment numbers for small businesses and nonprofits, that's, while often not the first economy that's taken a look at, their strength in numbers. So that's one example. I also want to share with those participating in the call today is, the Michigan Nonprofit Association is working in conjunction with the Council of Michigan Foundations. I talked about that organization earlier. We're also partnering with the Michigan Association of United Way and the Michigan Community Service Commission. Why is that important? M&A represents the voice of nonprofits. The Council of Michigan Foundations is philanthropy and corporate and family and community foundations. Michigan Association United Way manages the 211 system and also understands, things that are happening in communities via United Ways. But in particular, the 211 system is a major avenue by which individuals and communities all over Michigan are accessing information and sharing what the need is. And then also the Michigan Community Service Commission is one of the state's way in which it's responding and putting boots on the ground, but also looking at and managing volunteers, right? So a lot of what we haven't talked about is how many people have really stepped up in this window of time to volunteer. And those things combined together and understanding what that looks like, and that statewide organizations are working together, I think is really important for people to know. Those conversations are happening weekly to be sure that we're working in tandem and at least understanding what each other is doing and what we're seeing. And then lastly, of course, I wouldn't be a good state association if I didn't tell you that we're constantly working with our partners on the national level to be sure that we're bringing up the need out of Michigan, the stories that we're hearing on the ground, and working to be sure that we're advocating with our partners on a national level to be sure that nonprofits are not forgotten as new relief packages are put together. But that also that, you know, you get things like a checkbox on an application that actually allows the nonprofit to identify themselves as a nonprofit rather than trying to figure out what category that they might fit in, because that's what government programs are used to managing for, you know, for-profit organizations. So it's small things like that that in the end can be big wins, in addition to just the level of awareness that is made when we bring the collective voice of Michigan together. Also, you know, that partnership of talking about how M&A, CMF, and the Michigan Association United Way and the Commission are all working together. But, you know, in order for those things to happen and taking a look at those partnerships, you know, we're involved in those partnerships and we're a nonprofit ourselves. And much to anybody's dismay, we're not a large nonprofit. I think we very much represent what is the average size of a nonprofit. So when I think about what the Michigan Nonprofit Association has to do to kind of evaluate our capacity in those partnerships and think about how that transfers to all of you nonprofits that are on the call here, it's making sure that, you know, we assess what assets we bring to those partnerships already. Because part of what's going to be asked of all of us moving forward as we look at collaboration, as we look at partnerships, and we know this firsthand because our corporate partners and our philanthropic partners who may be funding aspects of our work moving forward, here's what they're asking us. You know, how is your sustainability as an organization directly yourself? And thinking about what does that mean for you to be a partner in something. The trend that we saw in 08 and 09 was partnership. And then those partnerships carried through between that time and this time. But some of those partnerships need to be revisited. You might need to go revisit networks that you haven't been a part of for a period of time and evaluate what's of value. What value do you bring to that partnership? What role do you play in that partnership? And you know, what will that partnership do to enhance your capacity and your work? That's what's being asked right now as people are responding, is that they are really taking a look at what is their in-house, what does your house look like, your own house as an organization look like, and then, you know, evaluating your own sustainability, and then taking a look at who you're working with. And maybe there's a role that you play that you just haven't traditionally played that you could play moving forward. You know, a lot of what's happening is organizations are looking for who could be the backbone, who gets to be the fiduciary, right? So maybe it's not about leveraging resources directly. Maybe you're part of something and somebody else is leveraging those resources on your behalf. Those are things to be thinking about as we move forward. And then lastly, I'll just say, I identified the 4 R's, as we call them internally at M&A. When you're thinking about these relationships and this work, and you're thinking of, you know, about, you know, those that are modeling and things that we're seeing on the ground right now, they're looking at it again through the lens of what's the short term and what's the long term. So I think when we look at this next wave of funding that's going to happen, you know, the needs of community right now are around relief. What is the immediate need? What are the basic needs for people? But eventually nonprofits that provide support to children, provide support to families who are dealing with trauma, how to deal with the fact that school was out. Like, there are so many nonprofits that have missions that are going to be back at the forefront, are going to be as important. And so again, thinking about it in the relief, the response, the recovery, and reform, how are you fitting into kind of that framework? And if you're not on the immediate front lines in the relief and the response phases, but you are in the recovery and the reform phases, what are you doing now to shore up what you need, including your partnerships and including your collaborations, to better position yourself from a sustainability point of view, as well as a strong partner, advocate, whatever is the word you want to use, so that when recovery and reform take shape in communities all over Michigan, you're best positioned to be who needs to be at the front lines responding when we get to those phases. So I just wanted to kind of bring that together to say that certainly when we look at what's needed in a relief, response, recovery, and reform, because I will say even M&A identifies, well, we're trying to be supportive in the relief and response. Our role is really going to take shape in the recovery and reform phases of this work on behalf of the sector. So I just wanted to use that as an example to maybe help think about how you're shaping collaboration and partnerships.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And really from my perspective too, when I see it from a staffing standpoint, what's the staffing going to look like? Because payroll is usually the highest line item in any budget for a nonprofit organization. What is the use of technology? What is the staffing going to look like post-COVID? So we can get into that as a separate thing. But I want to ask, before we open up for questions, I want to give Jason the opportunity to give maybe one or two quick examples of creative collaborations that you're seeing that you may not have touched on in this call.
Yeah, and I'll be real brief to get to the questions. I think number one thing I'll say, because many of the organizations that we already support will continue to. Again, this was about us looking at partners where we know they were making an impact and helping to scale them up. But what I will say, and I don't want to steal the thunder of our corporate responsibility group, because they'll name some actual grants later, and I'm not going to speak to those, but the process I think is super important. I want everybody to hear this. This goes back to the flexibility. So we've been in close connection with a lot of partners, and we have active grants. Well, obviously, when things kind of hit the fan 6 weeks ago, some of the grant deadlines couldn't be met. So we've created grant extensions to give people more time to actually finish their grant and get it in the process, but being respectful and mindful of the fact that they probably couldn't be able to hit the deadlines that we had out there for, for whatever monies they were looking to receive in a given quarter. The second thing was we're looking to, and we will, advance payments and relocate roughly up to 20% of the total grant for a COVID-specific need. Again, speaking to the flexibilities that corporations can provide, being mindful of the times. So can we forward that money while you're still in process of figuring out exactly what you're going to do, or maybe advance it based on previous expectations that were met? And then also, can we maybe take some of that money and put it directly towards anything you're trying to do that's COVID related? Third thing is adjustments to program scope and metric. And I mentioned this before. Obviously, programs that made sense prior to March 1st shifted. And even within an organization that's going to avoid drift and not just jumping on the bandwagon of trying to do something for funding's sake, which we won't help in that regard, we can help take dollars and move them around to give you flexibility to be effective in hitting your actual target or what it is you're trying to accomplish in that given cycle. And then finally, creating micro grants to support general operations and technology needs. So you mentioned earlier, Gary, about the whole world shifted from working in an office space to working from home, to having to leverage Zoom, to having to create, maybe better platforms for Wi-Fi or get laptops, like whatever. And we kept it broad. So whatever was needed to help you get what you needed to get mobile or to telecommute, whatever that looked like, we wanted to make sure that we were flexible in allowing you to use dollars for that purpose. So I think that, again, just speaks to what organizations can do in times like these. And we're glad that we're going to step up and do that for a number of organizations that'll be announced in the near future.
Great. So that's a perfect timing because we're coming up on 9:30 here. We want to allow questions from the audience directed to any of the panelists along the way. So Kyla, you're on, and are we going to manage that process and you have the questions in hand, or how are we going to open that up?
Yep, so we do have a couple of questions. Now is a great time for folks on the line. If you have questions and have not asked them yet, please do so and put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And Gary, the first question we have is, our region's corporate community does a great job of partnering with large, well-established nonprofits. What about small nonprofits? How can smaller groups build productive corporate partnerships?
And who wants to tackle that one first?
That sounds like that has me written all over it, although I don't think I'm the only one that can respond to it. I'll go first. I think, and this is with this question's been asked since the beginning of support and funding for nonprofits. And like I said, I've sat on small boards and wonder why I couldn't get people to take what we were trying to do or they would tell me, hey, go look at this organization and do it like them or partner with them. So I know what that feels like as a board member. Going back to the early days of what is now Detroit PAL and used to be Think Detroit PAL, because I was there at the very beginning when we helped start the first board for that organization. So I know what it's like to try to get people to listen to what your mission is and what you want to do to support the community. Having said that, I do think, and this happens a lot, and I do my best to try to navigate it the right way. I do think a lot of times there's still a lot of room to get educated on the process on what, when, and how to ask for funding from the corporate space. And to, I don't know if Kelly mentioned to Meredith earlier, begin to just navigate the relationship first to really understand what the corporate responsibility team is trying to accomplish. And then just making sure that you meet that corporate responsibility team's needs or understand what they're trying to do in the community. And every institution you go to may not be a good fit for what your mission is. And you just have to keep moving along to get to the one that is a good fit. Because I think in most cases, corporate dollars have been narrowed and focused in whatever they focus on. But it's just finding the right partner so that, again, part of the reason some of these organizations 5, 10, 15 years ago are where they are now is because they latched on when they were a lot smaller, and they continue to increase the level of relationship, execute whatever game plan that they agreed upon, and it became easier to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to keep working with this organization because the impact and the scale of their impact is big enough where for the dollars we're giving, we feel like we're making an impact in the community, as opposed to more of a startup focus where that may not be a larger corporation's ability to give to that in a meaningful way. Because I know for where I work, we rather give larger dollars to organizations than a bunch of smaller ones where we can't necessarily measure the impact over time. And like I said, that's just talking from our space as opposed to others. But I'm empathetic to the idea and to the understanding that a lot of times when you're in that growth phase of a nonprofit, you want the bigger companies to come on board and support your ultimate vision, which may not be what can be executed on in large scale today.
Great, thank you. Any perspective from you, from Meredith?
Yes, I would say also a good way of getting that corporate attention and the foundation attention for the smaller organizations is to partner with other nonprofit organizations that are doing similar work. And you see this a lot in the arts community, where smaller arts organizations are partnering with the larger ones. There's some shared services, some shared access, shared programming, shared space. And it also introduces the smaller organizations to a new pool of potential funders, a new pool of potential board members, and opportunities to look at their program differently or do their programs in different ways. So I think those partnerships are also really, really important for getting the attention and getting the attention of corporations and foundations. Also joining membership organizations. I know the arts community in Detroit is, the Culture Source is a really great opportunity for smaller organizations to get to know one another, to get to know larger organizations for shared learning, for shared resources. And Culture Source now has a fund that's available, a pooled fund like Kelly was talking about, for arts organizations to tap into for support in different ways, not just organizations, but also artists, independent artists. So I think that those types of opportunities to join membership organizations and to really network with others that are in your field or in your sector are very, very important.
So,
thank you.
Sorry, Gary. So
no, go ahead. I was gonna throw it over to you.
All right. So a couple things come to mind. I completely agree with the comments that have already been made. One thing to keep in mind too is the visibility that you can help a corporation get when they partner with you is really, really important. This whole notion of social responsibility has just expanded, and I think the possibilities are endless. So a couple ways that I think as a small nonprofit you could be thinking about that ability to partner with a corporation is a couple things is to not always necessarily be looking at what might be a dollar value for you. But for instance, a lot of what we saw happen when COVID-19 changed the way anybody was operating, including for-profit businesses. We saw several companies who said, we've got people who are really great at doing A, and do your nonprofits need A? You know, we've seen corporations help in some of the relationships and the partnerships that I identified that stepped up and said, you need a website and you need it turned on a dime. Our team will do it, because, you know, their businesses, their way of operating as a business was interrupted as well. And so they had people who had really great skills and had some extra time, which in, you know, as a nonprofit, we could use that all the time, and time in particular. Volunteers that work for your organization or are supporting your organization also work for corporations. Corporations value their employees, and they value what's important to their employees. So another way is when you think about recruitment of your board members, or when you think about engaging individuals as volunteers in your organization, make sure you're not overlooking the fact that some of them may have relationships with their own companies. You know, I have an experience with a nonprofit where I worked with the board chair, and the board chair was nervous about going to ask their company to sponsor the organization that they were a board chair of for an event. And in the end, when she navigated her corporation, she realized that her corporation not only wanted to support what was important to her, but was going to match that. And so there's opportunities like that all over the place in working with corporations. So I just wanted to offer that as some additional perspective of, you know, to just think about different ways to connect with corporations. And then what ends up happening oftentimes is those corporations make investments in that organization, whether they bring people out to support your events, or whether it ends up being corporate dollars or match dollars, or for that matter, recruiting more people from that corporation to be vested in your organization, which is also priceless.
Great, perfect. All right, next question up, Kyla.
Yeah, so this question is a bit more specific. It's been great to see the news about campaigns for emergency funds through United Way, funds for the arts, and others. Have you heard of any initiative to raise funds specifically for youth-serving organizations? The need for our services will continue to rise and will be long-term to help deal with the impact of students being out of school. And I think Kelly touched on this earlier, but I think perhaps if you know of any specific initiatives that might be coming online or being discussed.
Yeah, who wants to tackle that one?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any. I apologize. I don't have an answer for that question.
Yeah, so I don't know of any pooled funds specifically for youth-serving organizations, but I know some youth-serving organizations have received funds through the United Way Fund, and it's mostly for the, like Kelly was saying, the first R, right, around, you know, relief and things like that for the children and the families that they serve. That doesn't mean that there won't be anything in the future as we move through the other R's, right, especially when you come to recovery and you come to reform. And when we have more information about how it's going to, you know, what it's going to look like to safely engage young people again. I mean, I think that's something that we're all kind of waiting for. And I do think that at some point, as we learn more and, you know, 6, 8, 10, 12 months from now, there may be something to address youth serving organizations specifically in terms of engaging their youth and families again.
Great. All right, next question up.
So we don't have any more questions in the queue. Again, opening it up to anybody that's on the line. Gary, I think you might have had some additional conversation topics prepared. And one thing I think that, you know, I want to also make sure we incorporate is we've got a great diverse set of panelists on the line who represent, you know, the corporate, the philanthropic, and the nonprofit sectors. And so perhaps we could talk a little bit about how not just how folks on the line can think about their response and preparation, but from your own experience, how are your internally organizations preparing for the next, sort of economic phase? Are there things that your organization is doing that we can learn from each other?
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump on that real quickly because that's where I was going with the next question, which is, and really the final question, unless we get some other questions from the audience, is what does the post-COVID world look like from the variety of standpoints of what you're seeing? Everybody's talking about emergency funding and reacting to what's in the market currently, but what do you see some of the positive and negative shakeouts post-COVID down the road for the organizations that you're involved with?
Well, I'll start and then I can pass it on to anybody. But I think so. Just for context, from a technology standpoint, so I work for a global company that has over 250,000 employees around the globe, and within not even 3 weeks, we went to 90 and then quickly to 96% work from home across the globe. Like literally, just that. This is a large banking institution that fast across the globe. Everybody was work from home, and we actually reduced the amount of branches on the Chase side that was open. And we did it basically using 3 things: Zoom, which I think I'm a bit of a Zoom guru now. I didn't plan on being because I wasn't a month ago. Zoom, DocuSign, and Citrix, which is your ability to work from home and encrypt your stuff for corporations, right? So long story short, I say that to say that technology is probably it will be at the forefront and is at the forefront on how you leverage it to cut costs. I don't know if it'll ever be the same from a real estate perspective. And I think that plays into part even from shared workspaces that many nonprofits use, or just the real estate footprint that you have, because that's a cost. And when leases start to come up, and I haven't done all the research yet, but I'm starting to see reports, there's going to be a lot more leverage, number one, in the lessee's hand, but also, will you require that type of space? Will you have to reconfigure the space when you go back to make sure people are sitting 6 to 8 feet apart? What about the elevator? What about the restrooms? So all these things are now going to come more and more into play. And I think where nonprofits were maybe aspiring to get a storefront or to get space now may rethink that and wonder if they really need it. And organizations that are tied up in leases that may not fit the new normal, they have to really reconsider what that looks like. So that's just, I think, technology, real estate, those are things that, for the good or for the bad, for the positive or for the negative, will probably come more be more at the forefront as board members begin to ask tougher questions about what we need and don't need. And we expect the administration to really dig deep into where we can cut costs so we can be a going concern in the future. And some of the things that we've been supporting on our balance sheet, will it make sense going forward in the future?
Those are great. Thank you, Jason. And Meredith, what about you post-COVID? What do you think you're going to see out there?
Yeah, so again, I think the role of technology and how we use it is going to be really important. Like Jason said, I just think that more people, more organizations will turn to technology, and so that will increase the need for Wi-Fi and internet access and computers and other devices. And making sure that those are kind of standard, like those standard things in organizations. They won't be luxuries anymore. They will have to be standard, and we'll have to figure out how to support that going forward with organizations. I do think that right now we can't fully answer that question about what's going to happen post-COVID, because we don't know how to safely bring an audience back into a theater or an auditorium. We don't really know how to safely engage youth and bring them back into school. And so, making sure that they're safe and that their families are safe and that teachers and everyone who's going to be working with these populations are safe. I still think we're pretty much in a wait and see mode. And I know that we're all anxious to have those answers, but I think that we're going to have to be, we're going to have to wait. And that's, that's not something we do well in this country and as humans, but I think that this is forcing us to take some time to learn more and to make informed and educated decisions based on what we learn, and it's not going to come quickly.
And agencies having to be much more strategic along with their boards than ever before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Kelly, from your perspective to that question.
Yeah, so initially for us as an organization ourselves, thinking about how we're easing back into whatever is going to be our new way of operating. You know, we're a statewide organization. We have 2 offices, a footprint in Lansing and a footprint in Detroit. If there's one thing that COVID has reminded us to do constantly is to stop, pause, and really understand and respect what is important to each individual employee of ours. And I get it, as a small organization, you know, we can do that. But, you know, there's a lot of our staff who have lost people in the COVID-19 timeframe, and they have not really been afforded an opportunity to grieve. So, you know, there's real issues that for us as we re-engage that we're just going to be thinking about. And I just want to, you know, make sure to acknowledge that, you know, there are many on this participating today that as leaders in your organizations and as leaders in the sector, we can't forget to just be people and forget the human aspect that's tied to that. So making sure that we're not so stringent to get right back to work and back into the same old, but really understanding the flexibility that we need to afford our staff. That, you know, also doesn't legally set us up for liability when what somebody needs is not what another person needs. And then also, how do we continue to make sure our people are doing what they need to do for the work that we need to do. So internally as an organization, that is what we're thinking about. We are doing some scenario planning and looking at our budget, but that's also because our fiscal year aligns starting July 1. So it was very easy for us to just get into the ease of doing that. But we are evaluating, you know, what does it mean for us to have a decrease in revenue? What does it mean for us to have a dropping demand of our services? Or are we going to see an influx in our demand for services? It's hard to say. And then also long-term, what happens, you know, decisions we have to make now, whether it's, you know, taking a look at our own staffing structures in the short term, but also being mindful that whatever decisions we make in the short term have implications in the long term as stock fluctuations and values of investments and things like that catch up to us. So that's important. And then, of course, right now, externally, we'll be gathering information and trying to be the best voice and the best advocate for nonprofits all over Michigan to say, this is what is important. This is what our nonprofits need. That's what people should expect from a state association that says they're the voice of nonprofits. We'll be advocating with our statewide partners. We'll be advocating with our national partners to be sure that nonprofits are not forgotten in the midst of all of this. I agree on the technology and just helping to prep our nonprofits as best we can in building their capacity. That's what we'll be focused on.
That's great. And I want to just try one more time and see if there's any other questions hanging out there before we close out.
Hey, Gary, I just wanted to also say, if possible, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the fact that not everybody can work from home. There are so many, there's just a large portion of our workforce who don't have that option, who, you know, no matter what technology is available, they can't do their jobs from home. And I think that our nonprofit organizations, it's primarily our human service organizations and even some of the youth serving organizations, are going to have to figure out how to respond and still serve those folks who are out in the workforce every day. And their children still need a place to go. They need childcare. They need after-school services. They're going to need healthcare and mental health. And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there's a huge workforce out there who cannot work from home, no matter what is available to them. Great
point. Kyla, are there any other questions in the queue?
Yes, Gary. So we did get a couple more come in. So one, what trends are you seeing in giving from companies that are providing funds, for example, from a from a corporate giving versus a for-profits foundation? So I think specifically the example was like a Meyer Foundation versus sort of the Meyer corporate responsibility team.
Yeah, so I'll take that and just kind of give like my spin on that, and then because Meyer may be subtly different because Meyer is a corporation, but it's also, I think the foundation's tied to the family, which is maybe different than our setup. But I think it would be good to explain that JP Morgan Chase set up. So we have a corporate responsibility arm. That arm is really focused around pillars, and I mentioned them earlier: job skills, small business expansion, financial health, and then neighborhood revitalization. So those are the 4 pillars that, when you think of the work we're doing in communities, the $200 million commitment to Detroit, which doesn't have anything close to it or around the rest of the globe. That's what that is, right? And that team is led by September Hargrove and Marlo Staples. Separate from that, lines of business, whether it's my line of business or a consumer bank, they have their own money for sponsorships. And we'll be clear, sponsorships to us are like totally different from what September and Marlo do for the organization. And we make it a point to bifurcate those, because we don't want dinner sponsorships and tables to events to take away from the mission work. And they're both important. And I'm not saying one is more than the other, but the work that I say 90% of what our corporate responsibility team is trying to solve for are programs. And then where they can complement each other, maybe we partner, but just to kind of make that delineation. Then I'm the vice chair or vice president of our market leadership team, which is like the civic arm that the leadership sits on. And then we work to navigate the community in ways where we probably, have longer commitments, where we've done things that give us exposure on the art side, because we don't have an arts focus per se, but there are some things that we've been supporting over the years. And that's where that money may flow to, or there may be some significant events taking place in Detroit. And from a marketing aspect, we want to have some branding there. But then also where we believe in organizations and they don't fit necessarily the mission of the corporate responsibility team, and the price point may be too high for the particular line of business, then we try to be thoughtful on a quarterly basis at reviewing opportunity to support or not.
Great. Other answers from the panelists to that? Oh, okay.
Other questions. Has anyone heard of funds set up specific for workforce prep or employment issues for youth or adults? And Jason, I know you mentioned that that's one of the 4 focus areas. So I don't know, but if anyone has any thoughts on opportunities for those areas.
Kyla, could you repeat the question? It broke up a little bit. I apologize. I heard a piece of it.
Sure, sorry, no problem. The question is, has anyone heard of any funds being set up to address workforce prep and or employment issues for youth or adults?
None specifically, but I can check offline and maybe we'll get back to you and you can get that to the person that asked. I don't have anything top of mind at this moment.
So I don't know of any funds that are being set up for workforce prep. Agencies and organizations are looking at the training that they're offering differently. So they're moving some online if they can, and then helping their students access online courses if possible. And then also looking at opportunities responding to COVID-19 and what types of things will be needed, like deep cleaning services and what that entails, and training for the proper use of PPE, which is something that has just come out, recently, that PPE is great, but, some of these things you really need to be trained on how to use them properly in order to really protect yourself. And so there's something I know workforce agencies are starting to look at and shifting some of their training opportunities for students to be able to find work in a different way that responds directly to the COVID-19 crisis.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then I think the other remaining questions are around connection. And so normally we would be able to host this conversation in our space. Attendees would get to meet each other and get to meet each of you. And so I think for those that are interested in connecting, what might be the best way to connect with each of you offline or after this panel?
Email, this is Kelly. Email is best for me. And I think it's up on the slide. And if, yeah, that would be the best.
Yeah, same. I would, invite people to email questions or comments or, opportunities to set up calls or anything like that. Just shoot an email over.
Email as well.
Yeah, and the same with me. Kyla, does that wrap it up on questions from the group?
It does, yes. And so for those listening, we can make those emails available to the folks who have attended here today.
Great. So I want to close out with a couple of things. First of all, thank you to all of the panelists. They were invited on this call because they have a really unique perspective on what's going on in their respective communities from the foundation, corporate, banking side, from a trade association standpoint. We really appreciate your time. We know how hard it's been for everybody to adjust to this new environment. So getting access to your time this morning is extremely valuable and very much appreciated. And to the point of, I think a couple of different panelists talk about, let's talk about the humanity side of this. This is why we're all involved in the nonprofit sector. I would be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to the memory of Marlo Stoudemeyer. Most of you know Marlo. He has been involved in these panels and attended these functions, and unfortunately passed away in mid-March from the COVID. And Marlo was a great thought partner, a great promoter of Detroit, and I just think that we're all working in his memory, and everybody that has lost somebody to COVID. That's the real reason why we do what we do. So I want to thank you to the panelists. I want to give a shout out to Marlo's memory and to his family, and want everybody to keep up the important work that they're doing, not just because it's a big part of the economy, but it's a big part of our humanity and why we're all in this sector. I want to give a special thank you to Co.act and what they do. You've been at this for a while now, and even though you can't get everybody in the same space, these are very, very valuable conversations, and the resources that you provide to the community on an ongoing basis through TechTown and through the Wilson Foundation. So thank you all for joining us on this call. We have another one set. It might be in person, hopefully, down the road. And Kyla, I don't know if we have a date carved out and a subject matter for that.
We do actually, yep, on the screen here now. So you'll see the upcoming, the next two remaining conversations in this series. The next one is scheduled for August, which yes, hopefully will be in person, but we will revisit that, as Meredith said, with patience and as needed. And then the final in the series is scheduled after the election. So we have those dates and topics on the screen. We will have JP Morgan's corporate social responsibility team with us in August to talk more specifically about their skills-based giving strategy as well. And then please also, there's a link up here. We'll be emailing this to you also, but if you wouldn't mind, please giving us some feedback. Particularly as we have transitioned this to being a virtual conversation, we'd really appreciate you completing our survey. And I did open up in the chat box as well. Some of you brought up that we normally have the opportunity to network with each other. So while Co.act will provide the panelist contact, feel free in the chat to provide your contact information with each other if you'd like to connect with anybody else that's been with us today.
Great. So thank you for all of your participation. We look forward to the next session. And Kyla, thanks to you and your team for organizing this. And again, thank you to all the panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.